Today, I'm going to be presenting on my book, which was just published by Columbia University Press in April 2021. And I am going to really focus today's presentation with kind of two goals in mind. One is to simply introduce the three Tibetan scholars collectively known as the Three Polymaths to those who don't know about them. And I know several people in our audience do know about these incredible figures in Tibetan studies and Buddhist studies. And I hope, despite your knowing about it, that I can introduce something new to you about this, and also maybe talk more generally about the importance of history and literature and the interdisciplinary nature of our field. For those who don't know, the Three Polymaths, or Kepa is a title steeped in Tibetan history. And I'm going to talk about the origins of this title about halfway through this talk. I think Francois already introduced the term polymath to the French speakers, but in case any members of our audience don't know, a polymath is a scholar who has a deep understanding of many subjects of knowledge. And that's really what all three figures whom I studied have. They're really polymathic scholars. And so after the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong's death in 1976, three Tibetan scholars earned this title, the Three Polymaths, Kepa. And this is for their efforts to keep the lamp of the Dharma lit, even in the darkest hour of Tibetan history. So today I'm going to focus most of my talk on brief biographies of each of these scholars. And then I'll take you on a journey to Dentik Monastery in eastern Qinghai province of the People's Republic of China to tell you about a pivotal moment in the formation of this project. And this dovetails with the second goal of my presentation. That is to explain why understanding the lives and works of these three scholars and the title that they were given is important for Euro-American scholars of Asian studies more broadly, and for those in Buddhist studies and Tibetan studies specifically. I think in this age of knowledge specialization, their stories remind us of how important it is to see the interconnectedness of scholarly disciplines, especially the common roots of philosophy and language, not only in the Tibetan context, but in the humanities more generally. So this is, now I'll proceed chronologically to introduce the first of the so-called Three Polymaths. Tsetan Zhabdrung Jigme Rigpe Lodru, that is Tsetan Zhabdrung, like the other two polymaths who we will learn about more shortly, is credited with regenerating many aspects of Tibetan culture at a time of unprecedented socio-political change. Alak is an honorific title for a tuku, or reincarnate lama, in Amdo dialect. My Tibetan interlocutors often refer to him as Alaksang, or Alak Tsetan Zhabdrung Song. One of the main sources that I draw upon throughout my book is Tsetan Zhabdrung's autobiography. I translate the abbreviated title as Acoustic Ambrosia, that's for Nawe Dutsi. This documents his life and serves as the main source for this biography. Written in a style that mixes traditional literary techniques with colloquial language, Tsetan Zhabdrung's autobiography was praised by contemporary literary critic Dawa Lodru as one of the most significant Tibetan biographies, that is Namtar, that he has ever read. According to Acoustic Ambrosia, its author was born on the 22nd day of the 4th month of the Iron Dog year in the 15th Rapjong cycle of the Tibetan calendar. The roughly equivalent Western calendrical date of May 31st, 1910 is not provided in the life narrative. He was the second youngest of 8 children. His father had names in both Chinese, Young Sai, and Tibetan, Losang Tashi. His mother's patrilineal line was Chinese, but she went by her Tibetan name, Lamotar. His birthplace of Yadzi is more commonly known by its Chinese name, Jishajian, in today's Shunhua Salar Autonomous County of Qinghai Province. In describing his ethnic identity, Tsetan Zhabdrung drew upon classification factors that had been used in state projects to demarcate groups of ethnic nationalities. He identifies himself as Tibetan based on written and spoken languages, customs, and territory. His mixed ethnic background led to some controversy concerning his recognition as an incarnate Lama or Tulku. Despite initial disputes about his inclusion in the pool of 3 possible Tulku candidates, Amdo Shamar Pandita Gendun Tenzin Gyatso of Ditsa Monastery recognized him as the reincarnation of the 5th Tsetan Zhabdrung, a minor Geluk lineage. The young 6th Tsetan Zhabdrung took charge of his own monastic estate, as well as 6 other monasteries that he shared with Tsetan Khenpo at age 6. Tsetan is a place name, whereas Zhabdrung and Khenpo here are titles of high incarnate lamas. They shared the 6 encampment monasteries, the Garwa Kadruk, now located in far eastern Hualong and Minhe counties of Qinghai province. Among them is the famous Dentig Monastery, which you see in my background here, and I'll talk more about in a little while. At age 18, in the Earth Dragon year of 1928, Tsetan Zhabdrung completed his monastic studies under the supervision of Jigme Damkyo Gyatso and Gitang Rinpoche Yongdzin Pandita Losam Pelden. He took full vows and received the ordination name Jigme Rigpe Lodru in the presence of his 2 main teachers. At age 24 in the Wood Dog year, Tsetan Zhabdrung worked on the publication of Jigme Damkyo Gyatso's collected works. He not only compiled and edited these 15 volumes, but also raised funds for the construction of a printing house at Tuon Monastery to print them. Jigme Damkyo Gyatso's commentary, The Essence of Eloquence on the Interpretive and Definitive Teachings, Zhongne Lekshe Ningpo, is highly acclaimed and widely read by Geluk scholars today, including by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The wood blocks for these tomes were recarved and the printing house rebuilt in the 1980s after being burned to the ground in late 1965. The wood blocks for Jigme Damkyo Gyatso's collected works were kept at Tua Monastery until the early 2000s, when they were moved to Rungmo Monastery in Raipgong, where they are currently located. This photo shows some of the original wood blocks for the first edition of Tsetan Zhabdrung's collected works, housed at the same Tua Monastery, and these were started in the early 1980s while Alexung was still alive. The 9 volumes of the woodblock print were included along with other texts in the most recent edition of his collected works from 2007. Acoustic Ambrosia, Tsetan Zhabdrung's autobiography, highlights his visit with His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and the 10th Pension Lama Chökyi Gyaltsen in Beijing, 1954, where they all celebrated the promulgation of the 1954 PRC Constitution. Tsetan Zhabdrung worked with a team to translate this document into Tibetan. After Tsetan Zhabdrung returned to Xining, he was asked to teach at the newly founded Qinghai Nationalities University. A few years later, as those familiar with modern Tibetan history know, a popular uprising began to foment in Tibet's capital of Lhasa. This erupted from March 10th to March 23rd, 1959, when Tibetans rose up in revolt against Chinese troops. Fearing for his life, His Holiness was forced to leave Tibet in disguise on March 17th, and on March 23rd, Tibetans surrendered and the 5-star red flag was hosted at the Patala Palace, marking the end of what Tsering Shakya has called, quote unquote, the era of uneasy coexistence in Sino-Tibetan relations. The lives of all Tibetan religious leaders who remained in China were in peril as the Maoist era began in full force. Tsetan Zhabdrung's co-throne holder was murdered in 1958 when Tsetan Monastery was turned into a commune. And 8 years later, Alag Tsetan Zhabdrung was arrested and confined at Nantan prison in Xining for almost 12 years. After his release in July 1976, he spent 2 years recuperating. In the spring of 1978, Nawang Chodar, then director of the Tibetan Studies Department at Northwest Minzu University in Lanzhou, Gansu Province, invited Tsetan Zhabdrung to join the staff of the Tibetan Studies Department. It was there that Tsetan Zhabdrung trained the next generation of Tibetan historians, scholars, and translators. His former students comprise some of the most important people in Tibetan studies today. His graduate students included, the first group of graduate students included Pu Wencheng, who's a prominent historian and translator who writes in Chinese, Dawa Lodru, mentioned earlier, a great literary critic and now retired head editor of Spring Rain or Zhengchar, and Gao Rei, who is an administrator at Northwest Minzu University. This first group of graduate students accompanied Tsetan Zhabdrung on pilgrimage to Lhasa, where he gave lectures in the summer of 1981. A few undergraduate students in the Tibetan Studies Department in Lanzhou were also permitted to attend Tsetan Zhabdrung's graduate classes due to their high level of Tibetan. This group included Pema Bum, one of the leading scholars of modern Tibetan literature, writer and founder of the Latse Project, which focuses on translating works of Western literature into Tibetan. At Tsetan Zhabdrung's behest, Pema Bum continued at Northwest Minzu University to pursue his graduate work. And from his undergraduate days until Tsetan Zhabdrung's death, Pema Bum was a research assistant for Tsetan Zhabdrung. Other well-known graduate students included the national translator Repkung Dorje Ka and the writer Chepka Dorje Tsering. Many others sat in on his classes, studying with him informally. Up until his death in 1985, Tsetan Zhabdrung continued to give Dharma teachings and empowerments through Eastern Tibet. As I detail in chapter 5 of my book, he worked closely with the 10th Panchen Lama, as well as Shardung Rinpoche, one of his main disciples, to rebuild all of the 6 encampment monasteries, in addition to his own monastic seat at Tuk Monastery, among many other important monasteries in Amdo. He passed away peacefully at Labrang Tashi Keel of natural causes. A cremation ceremony at Labrang followed, which drew thousands of mourners. His main reliquary stupa is located within his compound at Dentik Monastery. So the second of the 3 Polymaths is Muge Samten. Similar to Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten Gyatso contributed to the revitalization of Tibetan education in Buddhist monastic and secular institutions as a writer and a teacher. Whereas Tsetan Zhabdrung's writings spanned 3 decades with 4 major works published in the 1950s, all of Muge Samten's texts were published after 1978. His most influential works were in the field of Tibetan literary history and language. Beyond these contributions, Muge Samten gained a reputation as a fierce advocate for Tibetan language education and reform. Unlike Tsetan Zhabdrung and Dungkar Rinpoche, the third of the 3 Polymaths, whom we will learn more about shortly, Muge Samten was never recognized as a reincarnate Lama. He rose to prominence among the Geluk elite due to his family's support, educational achievements, and intellectual acumen. Muge Samten Gyatso's name partly derives from his birthplace. He was born in the village of Muge in today's Sungpan County of Sichuan province during the waxing moon of the 11th month of the Wood Tiger year, that is, in late December 1914. Like Tsetan Zhabdrung, he penned his own autobiography. Muge Samten's autobiography is called The Luminous Mira, the author's own telling of what happened, which I abbreviated simply as Luminous Mira. It was written in 1992 to 1993 and is included in the first volume of his collected works, which was published in Xinying in 1997. Luminous Mira serves as the main source material for this biography. However, 3 other English language biographies exist. And also recently, Dungkar Tashi completed his MA thesis on Muge Samten. In my reading of Luminous Mira, the straightforward prose lacks the literary flourishes that are in Tsetan Zhabdrung's autobiography. Muge Samten was adept at verse, but few poems are interspersed within his life narrative. It details his family life, education, his arrest during the Cultural Revolution, Dharma activities, and lecturing positions at multiple universities. The majority of it is dedicated to recounting the numerous teachings he gave both in Buddhist monastic settings and at nationality universities from 1984 until his death in 1993. According to his autobiography, his family supported his education within the Geluk monastic system. Maintaining close ties with his family, Muge Samten moved from his home monastery in Sichuan province to the large monastic university of Labrang Tashi Keel in Gansu province at age 20. 7 years later, he became a fully ordained monk. And in 1946, Labrang's main incarnate Lama, the fifth Jamyang Shepa, Losang Yeshe Tempe Gyaltsen, returned from central Tibet. And during the exam period, Muge Samten achieved the highest of Geluk accolades, the Geshe Dorumpa degree, and was appointed as a teacher at the modern school established within Jamyang Shepa's residential compound called Labrang Tupten Podrang. Muge Samten taught language and grammar classes there for a few years, although Jamyang Shepa passed away in 1947. In 1949, almost immediately after the People's Liberation Army entered Xiahe, the town adjacent to the monastery Labrang Tashi Kyo, monastics were invited to visit China on study tours. To discuss this prospect, the second highest ranking incarnate Lama of Labrang Tashi Kyo Monastery, the sixth Gongtang Rinpoche Jigme Tempe Wangchuk, met with Muge Samten in nearby Lanzhou. Gongtang Rinpoche, who was about 10 years younger than Muge Samten, requested instruction on aspects of Tibetan history and culture at this time. Then Gongtang Rinpoche appointed Muge Samten to the rank of secretary or Drongchen and asked if he wished to go to China on a study tour. Muge Samten agreed to go to China as Gongtang Rinpoche's representative. Throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, each of these three scholars, Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten, and Dungkar Losang Thrinley, contributed to state-building projects to some degree. Muge Samten was the first to be recruited by the state. He traveled to Beijing for the first time with Geshe Sherab Gyamtso and began working in the propaganda division of the State Ethnic Affairs Commission in spring 1950. Muge Samten was residing in the nation's capital when Geshe Sherab Gyamtso announced the forthcoming peaceful liberation of Tibet on the radio in May 1950. Although Muge Samten claimed in his autobiography, quote, to have known nothing about politics, unquote, his career straddled political and Buddhist domains for the rest of his life. Like his mentor, Geshe Sherab Gyatso, he seems to have been committed to both CCP Marxist ideology and teaching Buddhist philosophy. Soon after arriving in Beijing, he began work at the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, where he translated and edited the People's Pictorial, Mimang Nyenpar. Here, this is Mirik Nyenpar that's photographed here, but similarly, a propaganda journal that showcased nationalistic achievements. When representatives from Lhasa arrived in Beijing in 1951 for the signing of the document that affirmed China's sovereignty over Tibet, the 17-point agreement, Muge Samten was requested to proofread the document for accuracy in translation. In May 1959, he was recruited by the Minzu Press to join Tsetan Zhabdrung on a team responsible for translating and editing the Tibetan language version of Mao Zedong's collected works. However, in the 1960s, as the political situation grew increasingly tense, Muge Samten was forced to wear lay clothes. Despite their outward appearances in Mao suits, both Muge Samten and Tsetan Zhabdrung maintained their vows, especially that of celibacy, throughout their lives. In 1966, Muge Samten was arrested at his workplace in a government office and then struggled against, enduring torture and public humiliation. He was then forced to do reform through labor, and in 1974, he returned home to his village of Muge in Nawa Prefecture to recover. In early winter 1978, Muge Samten wrote one of his most influential works, Entryway to a Clear Mind on Tibetan Writing. This book filled a desperate need in Tibetan language education. It was popular among many young Tibetans who had not been granted the opportunity to study Tibetan language in their youth due to the policies during the Maoist era. This generation included present-day Buddhist luminaries such as Khenchen Tsultrim Lodru, who now serves as the director of the largest Buddhist community in China called Larangar. In an interview with him, with Khenchen Tsultrim Lodru, he told me about how influential this book was to him as a teenager. Entryway to a Clear Mind didactically introduces Tibetan literary history and aesthetics. This work also includes Muge Samten's own poems, such as the Ode to the Magic of Generating Electricity and Ode to a Telephone, the titles of which exemplify how he adapted modern subject matter to traditional poetic forms. For him, modernizing Tibetan language education was key to reviving Tibetan culture. He took it upon himself to teach language and grammar by establishing schools in his home region of Nawa Prefecture in northern Sichuan province. Unlike Tsetan Zhabdrung and Dungkar Rinpoche, Muge Samten never held a permanent professorial position. However, he traveled widely and lectured at many Tibetan studies programs in China, including at Northwest Minzu University in Lanzhou, Qinghai Nationalities University in Xining, Southwest Minzu University in Chengdu, and Minzu University of China in Beijing. The autobiographical narrative ends shortly before his death, and an addendum to Luminous Mira explains how funds were collected for a memorial service and reliquary stupa at the end of the 5th lunar month of 1993. Okay, let's see, I'm gonna move slides. Here we go, the third of the three polymaths. The third member of the trio who came to be collectively known as the Three Polymaths was Dungkar Losang Thrinley, otherwise known as Dungkar Rinpoche. Unlike Tsetan Zhabdrung and Muge Samten, who penned their own life stories, the scant autobiographical details on Dungkar Losang Thrinley are jotted in the chronological tables at the end of his reference work known as the Dungkar Singso Chemo, which I translate as the Dungkar Encyclopedia. The most comprehensive biography on Dungkar Losang Thrinley to appear in English was written by Pema Bum for Lhotse Library Newsletter. Another biography written by his son, Dungkar Jigme, offers a personal perspective on his family life. In my book, I draw upon these different biographies, as well as an illuminating article based on interviews with Dungkar Rinpoche, which was written by Tenzin Gelek, a scholar and translator and a founding member of the Lhotse Project, along with Pema Bum mentioned above and Christina Dilatio. All sources agree that the child later recognized as Dungkar Rinpoche was born in 1927 in the village of Jomo, under the jurisdiction of Jomo County in the Kungpo region of Tibet, near the border with Arunachal Pradesh. In the Iron Sheep year of 1931, he was recognized as the reincarnation of the 7th Dungkar incarnation by the 13th Dalai Lama. He began learning to read aloud under his parents' care, and in 1935, he took the throne at Khumpho's Tashi Chuling. The famous Gelug scholar Pabunka gave him his Dharma name. According to a brief introduction to the author, which is found in the Dungkar Encyclopedia, he was considered a child prodigy. He memorized the entire monastic assembly recitations, over 200 commentaries, and the root texts of the so-called 5 great treatises, which are the 5 main topics of Gelug Buddhist scholasticism. From the Fire Mouse year of 1936 until late 1945, he resided at Khumpho's regional division of Saramay Monastic College at Sera Monastery near Lhasa. There he studied with Geshe Nawang Gendun for 10 years. At Losar, ushering in the Fire Dog year 1946, he received the Geshe Larumpa title during the Great Prayer Festival in Lhasa. Throughout most of the 1950s, he practiced Buddhism and received teachings from many of Tibet's Buddhist luminaries, but by the end of the decade, he gave up his monastic vows. In 1954, he was appointed as disciplinarian or Geku at Gyuto Dratsang, the Upper Tantric College. Alongside these activities, he also became involved with Chinese communists around 1956. This was about 5 years after that of the other 2 polymaths, Muge Samten and Tsetan Zhabdrung. He was appointed as the vice director of the local Dakpo and Khumpho counties branch of the State Administration for Religious Affairs. This office is responsible for both implementing the state's religion policies and enforcing official regulations as directed by the State Council and dictated through the United Front Work Department of the party. According to the biography by Pema Bum, Dungkar Losang Thrinley also was one of the 16 Geshe to serve as an examination debater when the 14th Dalai Lama took his Geshe Larumpa examinations in early 1959. According to 2 biographies, he arrived in Beijing in 1960 with his first wife, indicating that he had renounced his vows prior to this. At this time, Dungkar Rinpoche launched his teaching career that spanned 4 decades. In September 1960, at the behest of Zhou Enlai, he was recruited as a professor for the graduate program specializing in Tibetan studies within the Department of Ethnic Nationalities Languages at Minzu University of China, formerly called the Central Nationalities Institute. For 5 years, he taught many courses on Tibetan grammar, poetics, history, and Buddhism. Similar to Tsetan Zhabdrung, he wrote a textbook commentary on Tibetan poetics as part of the secular curriculum for Tibetan language programs at universities in China. Copies of the 1957 print of Tsetan Zhabdrung's Nyenak Chidung still exist, but pre-Cultural Revolution publications of Dungkar Rinpoche's Gateway to the Art of Literary Figures for Writing Poetry do not seem to have survived that tumultuous time when many books were burned in public assemblies. As a professor in Beijing in the early 1960s, Dungkar Rinpoche began collecting terms that were included in his most ambitious work, the encyclopedia that bears his name, the Dungkar Encyclopedia, which was only published after his death in 2002. Before the Cultural Revolution began, he had been forced to return to Lhasa from Beijing and was assigned on a work team for education in Shigyatse and Gyensé. This was part of the political movement known as the Socialist Education Campaign, which had started in 1962 and spread through Tibet between 1964 and 1966, whereby students and professors were tasked with promoting socialist thought. Dungkar Rinpoche recalled seeing his father wear a hat in a public struggle session shortly after the launch of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. Due to his social status, Dungkar Rinpoche was sentenced to undergo reform through labor from the middle of 1966 until 1973. According to Tibetologist Heather Stoddard, who met frequently with Dungkar Rinpoche in Lhasa in the 1980s and early 90s, he had told her that he was forced to work on roads at this time. Although the Cultural Revolution was not over in 1973, after that, Dungkar Losang Thrinley no longer had to do any hard labor. His erudition and political leanings made him a choice candidate for historical and cultural projects. For example, in 1974, he was put to work in the Tibetan Autonomous Region's archives and on the Tibetan Autonomous Region's Revolutionary Exhibition Hall. In 1975, he was assigned, along with Muge Samten, to assist in Zheng Yixun's editorial team in Chengdu on the bilingual Tibetan-Chinese dictionary, the Pogyat Siksochemong. And then at the Tibetan Autonomous Region's Cultural Relics Supervisory Office, located within the Dalai Lama's former summer residence at the Norbalinka in Lhasa, he had unfettered access to rare texts, which he used as many sources for his essays, such as one on the history of the Patala and his controversial essay, The Merging of Religious and Secular Rule in Tibet, which he began in 1977. In 1978, Dungkar Rinpoche was invited back to Minzu University in Beijing, where he writes prolifically, including his famous work on select terminologies of the Red Annals. He was a professor there for the next 7 years. In 1985, he returned to Lhasa to take up a professorial post at Tibet University, where he remained until his retirement in 1996. He still traveled frequently to Beijing during this time as vice director of the China Tibetology Research Center, which opened its doors in 1986. In the course of Dungkar Rinpoche's professorial life, he guided the career of many famous Tibetan students, including Dundruk Gyal, who is regarded by many as the first modern Tibetan writer. Also, Lakpa Phuntsok, the Tibetologist who began his studies with Dungkar Rinpoche in Beijing in the 1960s. And Druktar, the head of Tibetology Research Center in Gansu province and author of many histories of Amdo, also studied under him, as well as Chen Qingying, who is an eminent historian who writes in Chinese, among many others. Dungkar Rinpoche's son, Jigme, remembered his father as a kind and compassionate person who had encouraged him to be a good person and reminded him of the necessity of embracing humility. Dungkar Jigme further observed that his father diligently completed projects close to his heart. Quote, "He wrote essays and books with great diligence and always encouraged me to be industrious in whatever I did," end quote. Although mainly known as a secular university professor and Marxist scholar, Dungkar Rinpoche bestowed some Dharma teachings in the mid-1990s. His activities were not as widespread as those of Tsetan Zhabdrung and Muge Samten, both of whom traveled extensively, giving many empowerments, teachings, and conferrals of Buddhist ordination vows. Nevertheless, as I showed in the previous slide, Dungkar Rinpoche resumed his throne as an incarnate Lama in 1992, according to Pema Bum's biography on him and a photo taken by Tsetan Zhabdrung. 5 years later, on July 21st, 1997, Dungkar Losang Thrinley passed away at the age of 72 in Los Angeles after battling cancer. Obituaries appeared in English, such as those published by the UK's Independent and the Tibet Information Network. On the 20th anniversary of the scholar's death, the College for Higher Tibetan Studies at Sarah in India held a conference commemorating his contributions to Tibetan history. So despite enduring immense personal hardships, all three Buddhist scholars studied here, Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten, and Dungkar Rinpoche, energetically reclaimed their polymathic trainings in the post-Mao era and would become known as the Three Polymaths. They further transmitted nearly all the traditional fields of learning, including language, poetry, history, astronomy, calligraphy, and Buddhist philosophy in the post-Mao era. In this way, I view them as in the lineage of creative Tibetan scholarship, which traces its roots back to Sakya Pandita Kunga Gyaltsen, who first brought the traditional fields of learning to Tibet, and which continue to innovate due to the scholarship of wonderful scholars such as Butun and Jumgun Kuntrul and Jupi Mipam, among many others. So now that I've introduced you or reminded you of Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten, and Dungkar Rinpoche, I will turn to the second goal of my presentation, to explain why their lives and writings and this title are so important to know. I will do this by way of a story about my journey to Dentik, which exemplifies a kind of flashpoint of this project. And this is from the opening passage of my book, Lineages of the Literary. In the 10th century, Dentik Monastery became a place of refuge for three Buddhist polymaths renowned for saving Tibet's monastic tradition from near extinction. Surrounded by vertiginous peaks and conglomerate rock formations, Dentik Monastery today has an air of majestic sanctity reminiscent of Santa Maria de Montserrat near Barcelona. The first time I visited the mountain retreat in May 2008, I trekked for 3 hours from our rustic accommodations in a nearby village with an entourage of my 2-year-old daughter, Tibetan friends, and 2 research assistants. During the course of the hike, I noticed young children and their families appearing from distant footpaths to converge at the same dirt road, leaning over the most accessible paths. As we walked down the other side of the mountain, monastic buildings and cave complexes came into view. The scene was made all the more striking by the brilliant azure blue sky on that day. We arrived to celebrate the annual showing of the Ani Loja, the Naga or water serpent deity that blesses children. The Ani Loja festival also includes a yearly ritual display of sacred objects originally from central Tibet, prayer ceremonies, and of course feasting. The day's events began with the ritual circumambulation of the complex. We followed the clockwise circuit of Buddhist pilgrimage. I occasionally paused in amazement to stare at the ancient murals painted high on crags, and in single file, we entered the narrow caves built into cliffs, similar to the Mogao grottos at Dunhuang. We assembled at one of the larger sites called the Cave of Buddhist Adepts, where we listened to a monk whom I call Jigme narrate the story of the Three Polymaths, Kepa Misum, of the 10th century, and how they safeguarded Buddhist monasticism in Tibet a millennium ago. Jigme expounded a history retold in many Tibetan texts, such as Butun's religious history, the Blue Annals, and the Oceanic Annals, a religious history of Dome. These sources emphasize the vital role of the Three Polymaths in saving the monastic tradition at a perilous time. In the 9th century, when the Tibetan Emperor Udumsan, posthumously known as Langdharma, persecuted Buddhism in central Tibet, 3 men escaped. The so-called Three Polymaths, Mar Shakyamuni, Yo Gejong, and Sung Rapsel, carried Buddhist scriptures with them. After traveling for some time, they sought refuge at Dentik Monastery, where they ordained a boy in the Mulasavastavadan Vinaya, preventing their lineage from extinction. As an adult, he became known as Lachen, the Great Lama Gumpa Rapsel, and further transmitted this monastic ordination lineage to the 10 men from central Tibet, including Lume, whose return to central Tibet marked a new period of Buddhist time, the later diffusion of Buddhism. According to oral tradition at Dentik Monastery, this cave of the Buddhist adepts was the site of these ordinations. Tibetan historians recognize that the actual dates for the 3 Polymaths and Lachen Gumpa Rapsel may never be known because the historical record is so fragmented. But as I listened to this history retold at the cave, the significance of the interplay between storytelling, devotional practices, and communal identity crystallized. The retelling of the 3 Polymaths history imbued this place with the sanctity of a pilgrimage site, thereby reinvigorating the community with a shared past that ignored otherworldly concerns, such as the state government of the People's Republic of China. While the state's presence was not immediately seen at Dentik, its power was felt because of increased military troops and public security personnel on the roads approaching the vicinity, a result of the demonstrations and protests taking place throughout the Tibetan Plateau in 2008. After I returned to my research base in Xining, several monks requested that I translate a guidebook to Dentik Monastery into English, which they later self-published. Their work was based on this oral history and on a catalog of Dentik Monastery, a text by the 6th Tsetan Zhabdrung, Jigme Rigpe Lotru. I began to see parallels between the retelling of the 3 Polymaths story and the re-establishment of Dentik Monastery's sacred festivals, including the Ani Luja festival, with themes that emerged in my interviews with former disciples and students of Tsetan Zhabdrung. There was a symbolic connection between the 3 Polymaths' heroic efforts to save Buddhism in the first millennium and the survival of Tibetan Buddhist culture in the 20th century China, end quote. Well, several years passed before I could return to the writing of this book. I had returned to the States in 2009, and then I finished my dissertation on Tsetan Zhabdrung and graduated with my PhD from Indiana University in 2011. Then I began teaching and teaching and teaching, a lot of teaching. But in 2017, the Robert Ho Foundation in Buddhist Studies, I was given a reprieve from this teaching due to the graces of this wonderful fellowship in Buddhist Studies that's administered by the American Council of Learned Societies. The Robert Ho Family Foundation Program in Buddhist Studies is the title of it. So it was at this time during that research that I came across this article titled Tibet's 3 Polymaths of the Young Dar Era. It began actually circulating on the digital platform of Weixin, and then in an online journal that you see here. The author here intertwined the biographical lives of the 3 20th century scholars, Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten, and Dungkar Losang Thrinley, in no uncertain terms. And this reminded me of what Pema Bum had written in Dungkar Rinpoche's biography for the Lhotse Library newsletter that, quote, many Tibetan intellectuals consider the impact of the destruction of Tibetan culture during the Cultural Revolution was the same as that of Langdharma's destruction of Buddhism in Tibet some 1,000 years earlier, and thus the achievements of the 3 modern scholars can be compared to those of the 3 earlier scholars, end quote. It was at this time that I reviewed my fieldwork notes and then began to write about how the 3 Polymaths title emblematically connected the efforts of 3 monastic scholars of the first millennium to their 20th century counterpoints, attributing agency and symbolic meaning to efforts to preserve and continue Tibetan Buddhist culture. Like their 10th century predecessors, they were charged with saving Tibetan Buddhism at a pivotal time. Additionally, their efforts to preserve Buddhism, similar to those of the historical monastics, marked a new timeline for Tibetan Buddhist history. This new era is signified in the title of I'm going to keep there, in the title of the article. The Young Dar era refers to a third epoch in the historical development of Tibetan Buddhism. Translated as the era of Dharma's rediffusion, the Young Dar orders time in a way that ignores the standard historical sequencing of events as determined either by the death of China's founder, Mao Zedong, in 1976, or by the socioeconomic reforms initiated by Deng Xiaoping in 1978. The concept and the term Young Dar finds its foothold in two earlier divisions of Tibetan Buddhist history. The earlier diffusion of the Dharma, the Tempa Nadar, between the 7th and 9th centuries, and the later diffusion of the Dharma, the Tempa Chidar, beginning in the 11th century. This ordering of time occurred within Buddhist historiography and simultaneously within the nation state of the People's Republic of China, within which these scholars were considered upstanding citizens. In taking up this project on modern Tibetan Buddhist figures within China, I faced an immediate conundrum: how to study this subject matter without undue influence from polarized accounts of Sino-Tibetan historiography. The voices of exiled Tibetans emphasize Chinese destruction of Tibetan culture and curtailments of religious freedom, while mouthpieces of the CCP laud the state's role in supporting Tibetan institutions, especially financially, within the motherland. This study, I hope, on the lives and works, I hope counters a common presumption that Tibetan leaders active in the People's Republic of China were mere political collaborators. Frequently in the Western imagination, it seems as if the leading Tibetan players in China could only take on the role of either collaborator or resistance fighter. However, this binary model fails to account for the variety of repertoires, choices, and types of knowledge employed by these intellectuals in their subject positions as teachers, scholars, and writers in both Buddhist, monastic, and secular state institutions. Oh, you know what? I realize now that I think I have the wrong PowerPoint up, but anyway, it's okay. It's kind of, I had another one, but it's okay. So in order to understand how monastic scholars such as Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten, and Dungkar Losang Thrinley contributed to both the formation of Tibetan studies as an academic discipline and the revitalization of Tibetan Buddhism after 1979, I build on the notion of moral agency as employed by Sabah Mahmud. In this work, the concept of moral agency signifies the capacities and skills needed for performing particular types of moral actions as bound to historically and culturally specific disciplines of subject formation. This conceptualization is particularly helpful to move beyond a binary model of agency as either enacting or subverting norms, the premise underlying the collaborator resistance fighter dichotomy. I draw upon moral agency as historically and culturally disciplined capacities of actions and skills in order to question what sorts of conditions enable intellectuals to express their ethical values, to promote institutions, and to uphold religious practices even under dire political restraints. I detail how disciplines of subject formation in this case are embedded in Geluk Buddhist texts, practices, and embodied knowledge thereof, what I refer to as religious epistemes. And throughout Lineages of the Literary, I draw attention to articulations of specific epistemic values and acts of religiosity at particular historical moments. My study is indebted to earlier studies of modern Tibet, such as the groundbreaking volume co-edited with Matthew Kapstein, Buddhism in Contemporary Tibet, Religious Revival and Cultural Identity. In the introduction to the volume, Goldstein developed a nuanced approach to the notion of revival, especially in the sense of denoting a return to an original Tibetan way of life. He assessed that once the sluice of Chinese control was raised, the outpouring of religious activity in the post-Mao era was not the same as that prior to the 1950s. Although the sudden resurgence of Tibetan religious life after the lifting of restriction gives the illusion of revival, Goldstein astutely pointed out, quote, "The matrix of beliefs and practices that comprise Tibetan Buddhism have not been restored to their original state," end quote. He observed, quote, Some individual cultural traits have reemerged identical with the past, but others have reappeared somewhat changed, and still others have not reemerged at all. End quote. In other words, revival, if we are to use that term for convenience's sake, was neither homogeneous nor monolithic across Tibetan areas of China. I build on these works, as well as that of recent studies in Chinese religions, to argue that what we observe in post-Mao era Tibet is an ongoing dialectic between Chinese state and local actors involving dynamic processes of adaptation that was and continues to be dependent on various political, social, and local conditions. So the ways that Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten, and Dungkar Losang Thrinley, the three Polymaths, navigated between the discursive territories of Gelug scholasticism and state discourse might be conceived of viewing Sino-Tibetan relations through a new lens. And my book relies on these texts, or select texts, by each of the three polymaths as maps that take on a new path throughout the PRC state formation. Their biographical lives and their writings, I think, bring new perspectives on this time period and illuminates hope, strategies, and compromises for Tibetans living in China. I also discuss the literary and social context that permitted the writing of these Buddhist scholars to emerge in the post-Mao era. The interweaving of literary and social context is really imperative here and can serve to remind us of the benefits of interdisciplinary education. And so I'll end my talk today with a prime example of this. So while the nation state of the People's Republic of China did not allow the areas populated by Tibetans across various provinces to unite politically, in works on literature and language, it was possible to discursively unite Tibetans, in part because the Chinese state policy on nationality minorities permitted language as one of the main factors of ethnic identity construction, as we learned in my earlier account of Tsetan Zhabdrung's own self-identity construction. A type of national Tibetan identity centered on language within Minzu discourse can be found in both the 1950s and post-Mao era. A powerful verse in Tsetan Zhabdrung's A General Commentary, someone has their mic, there we go. A powerful verse in Tsetan Zhabdrung's A General Commentary on the Mira of Poetics, the Nyenak Chidong, exemplifies this. The original print in 1957 is still extant, and subsequent prints after 1981 underscore written literary Tibetan as a unifying force. Tsetan Zhabdrung wrote, "Similar to countless blazing stars strewn upon a dark and boundless sky, I delight in teaching diligently on the 100 ornaments, glorious poetics praised by Indian scholars, with words common among the people, Tibetans here, in Amdo, Kham, and Central Tibet, nomads and farmers compose mellifluous words, write with a flash of the pen." Tsetan Zhabdrung proudly charges literary Tibetan with the discursive ability to unite speakers of all three main dialects of Tibetan language mentioned in the verse. Tsetan Zhabdrung not only makes the case that the literary language is common across dialectical differences, but also delights in phonetic wordplay, dragyen. As I detail in Lineage of the Literary, when Tsetan Zhabdrung muses with the difficult, the Shakawa phonetic literary figures in this poem, he defies a historical claim that Tibetan language wasn't as sophisticated as Sanskrit to handle this particular type of literary adornment. This argument will be picked up again by later Tibetan writers and become integral to assertions on Tibetan identity around language. But to conclude here, I would like to point out how this poem showcases the capacious beauty of the Tibetan language. Although not all present here can read Tibetan, it is easy to see that there are no vowel markers above or below the syllables in the first stanza. That is that in the whole first quatrain of this verse, only one vowel is used for each of the 9 syllables in all 4 lines. Okay, can you imagine writing a poem in French or in English or Italian with only one vowel? I don't know. In the second stanza, this switches so that each line, also each 9 syllables long, is written using only one vowel per line. These literary acrobatics, a skill in Tibetan phonetics, was only one type of wordplay. A great showman of Tibetan poetics, Tsetan Zhabdrung unleashes his pen to discursively unite the different vernacular dialects to deliver a striking poem. This literary context is one aspect of this study, but also let's consider the historical context. In Tsetan Zhabdrung's autobiography, Acoustic Ambrosia, the author recalls that he wrote this work for students at Qinghai Nationalities Institute in 1957, quote, in order to accord to modern times, end quote. 20 years later, in the aftermath of the Maoist years, his commentary once again became a textbook for teaching poetics. In reprint after reprint, and according to Lauren Hartley's work, there's been over 40,000 reprints of this. This verse, delighting in the mellifluous words common among all Tibetans, begins chapter 2 on literary figures. So as mentioned earlier, Dungkar Losang Thrinley and Muge Samten also wrote influential commentaries on poetics that they taught at Minzu University in Beijing and Southwest Minzu University, respectively. This example, similar to other sections of my book, tells the story of how three remarkable Tibetan scholars, Tsetan Zhabdrung, Muge Samten, and Dungkar Rinpoche, transmitted their polymathic knowledge to the next generation and thereby rescuing Tibetan language and culture from near extinction within the PRC in the aftermath of the Maoist era. So thank you. That was my time for talking.